Setting up.
All right. I think we are live. Seeing it on live on Facebook. Welcome everyone to the inaugural Revolutionary War Roundtable with the Emerging Rev War, or Rev War Revelry here.
Say that 3 times fast.
Yes.
Sunday evening. I'm joined today by fellow ERW historians Rob Orson and Mark Malloy. But more importantly, we are joined by Stacy Fraser, the Collections and Outreach Coordinator for the Lexington Historical Society, who doesn't know what exactly she got herself into, but
I mean, I've met you guys. It's not like I'm going to be blindsided.
Exactly. She has met us, not only over Facebook Live. So with that, we were talking today is 245 years ago, where the shot heard around the world in Concord, but obviously the first shots on Lexington Green, maybe. We'll talk about that and other things. So with that, we'll get started on the events 245 years ago today, April 19th, 1775 in Massachusetts. So who wants to take it from here? But what's the first thing? What's the first thing people should know about Lexington Concord? Is this really where the war started?
I'll jump on that real quick.
Rob looks thoughtful. You take that.
I'll jump on that. I think really Lexington is where the war started. But there are a lot of other places where the events leading up to Lexington really took off. You have, up in New Hampshire at Fort William and Mary in December of the year before, 74. You have the American militia up there attacking the fort, capturing the fort, taking supplies and guns. And actually there's gunfire between the British regulars and the militia up there at the fort. So really the first shots, you can argue that. Then you have Salem a few months later in February of 75, where you have a standoff between the militia there and a regular column marching out looking for supplies and cannons specifically. So you have lots of different smaller events leading up to Lexington. And I think if you look at all those events and you can see the culmination of how what happened there on the Green in Lexington, because these British regulars have been out many times and have been harassed here and there. They've been confronted by other militia before. So I'll say Lexington is where it started, but I'll also say with that, there's other things leading up to Lexington that really makes what happens at Lexington such an important event, an important day in general.
Sounds like you're trying to please everybody there.
Well, you never know who's watching.
No, it's true. We don't want to offend, people a bit for, well, what's now not William and Mary, it's Newcastle, but either way.
Right.
No, I think that's true. I mean, I think that, it's pretty easy to say, yes, this is where the real sort of, not professional war, but that we're taking this seriously now kind of thing. If you're looking at like William and Mary, it's looking more kind of a defensive thing, or there's been a lot of stuff happening, not by accident, but, clashes and things like the Boston Massacre that just sort of happen. And nobody's really going into it being like, we're going to do it this way. We're going to start a rebellion today, or we're going to, obviously the British troops have orders, but I feel like things were kind of, because of a lot of those incidents, escalating. And then by the time we get to Lexington and there's people, in town who aren't sure, we know in the end, because of later communications, that they're really, the goal is to go to Concord and retrieve, the stolen cannon and ammunition. But, there was also the theory or the idea floating around, they also may have been coming to Lexington to arrest Hancock and Adams. So there's a lot of sort of like, okay, whatever's going on, there you go. I was gonna say, good job, guys. But yeah, between Sam Adams Beer Company and John Hancock Insurance, we are missing 2 big corporate sponsor opportunities up here. We gotta get in touch with them. If anyone's listening, again, if you never know who's listening.
Right.
But yeah, no, I think you're right, Rob. I think that Lexington didn't happen in a vacuum. It's not like all of a sudden there were just, troops showing up. I mean, this is after years of the troops being quartered in Boston and things just kind of escalating. And that's something you get more when you have Boston's a pretty central, location for Eastern Massachusetts. And so there are these forays into the countryside and, people are having these little interactions. And as we know, the city of Boston is just like completely full of troops. And that's very much on people's minds. So I think a lot of things went into it, but then by the time it got to Concord, it was not inevitable, certainly. They could have let him pass by, but then maybe something would have already happened at Concord, so it's, yeah, I think you're right. I'm not going to die on the hill for Lexington was, the first anything, because we know of other incidences that obviously added to
Mark will make a stand.
it.
I mean, I just think it's interesting, a new one that I, hadn't really heard of much of, but until if you're an Outlander fan and you watch that show, they talk about the Battle of Alamance down in North Carolina back in 1771, where not British regulars, but Royal Militia going up against the regulators, and I think there's a monument on that battlefield, and Rob and Phil and I were talking about going down there this fall to actually see that along with other sites of the Revolution. But they have a monument saying that's the first battle of the Revolution. So I think a lot of people like to stick their flag into a superlative like first or whatever. But it's just interesting. Yeah. I think commonly though, throughout most people, I think, Lexington and Concord, thrown together, they always say that's the beginning of the Revolutionary War.
Well, that's a good point too, Mark. A lot of these other things that Rob mentioned, for example, were things that kind of happened like in one town. It was relatively quick and over with. Whereas what we're looking at is, basically the length of a marathon. They're marching from Boston Common, they're going through, sneaking through, Cambridge and Menotomy, not very effectively, into Lexington. There's a skirmish there. They continue, fight at Old North Bridge. Then they fight Parker's Revenge on the way back. There's the running battle the whole way. So it's not just sort of one battle over in a half an hour or even a few hours. It's like the whole day. It affects multiple towns. It really feels like a big significant moment.
Yeah, that's something. I mean, what were the full casualty figures for the two engagements? Because some people, whenever they hear Rev War engagement and they hear the numbers, they're usually saying, oh, that's not as many as I would expect. But considering the size of the communities and warfare at the time, I mean, Lexington Concord was really, really bloody for that time period and at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and by the end of the day, in part because how things went on the second half, in the retreat, sort of after the reinforcements came out from Boston, things got a lot bloodier. So by the end of it's kind of one of those things where if you were so crass as to keep track of how many British dead? 0. How many colonists dead? This many. And go through the day, that ratio balances itself out. I don't remember at the end of the day what the finals are, but it ends up pretty close to similar, for the British casualties, at least the injuries, maybe not all the fatalities, but, there were British soldiers that were left behind, throughout Lexington and other towns. So there's definitely, that sense that the British finally were like, oh, we actually sustained a lot of losses here. This is an actual, something we have to contend with. So, and I mean, Gage had thought that for a while, but he had to convince other people.
And if you look at what Lexington, the company there in the green in the morning, they almost suffered a third casualties of the guys that were in line there. So that's pretty bloody when you look at the numbers there at the very first shot there in the morning of the 19th. You're talking almost a third of the men that were on the green or either killed or wounded. So that's pretty bloody in its own right. But like Stacy said, you have, I had the numbers here. The British had 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. That's pretty big for a Revolutionary War battle that really wasn't a stand-up, fight. It was pretty much, as she said, a marathon.
Yeah, it's and that's the other thing though too is those guys at Lexington that were in the initial engagement. Then the British go all the way to Concord, and then the fighting there. And then when they come back, some of those Lexington militia actually show back up, right, to fire back in.
Yep,
yeah, Parker's Revenge. Yep.
Parker's Revenge, yeah, which is kind of a later, colonial revival name for the battle. But yeah, no, and if you guys haven't checked out the research, or anyone listening hasn't checked out the research that Minuteman National Park has done recently, they did the first new archaeology in the park in about 20 years, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and they finally properly cited the Parker's Revenge site. For years, it had been intended, or it had been thought to be on this bluff that overlooks Route 2A, where when they went up and put it this way, it's been one of those hangout spots where when they went and did the first surveying, they were not surprised to find hundreds of beer caps. But now it's that kind of a site. And so we have all kinds of jokes about, which do the colonists prefer, Michelob or Budweiser? But, that was their first sign that maybe this isn't the site that we're thinking of. It's also like literally up on a bluff. So it's like, that's not a place to hide at all. Like there's it doesn't really make sense to be that high up and visible for either side. So then they actually did research and they found the site and they found like everything they needed to. They found one musket ball. Okay, that's maybe just a dropped ball. That's hunting or something. They found two. And then eventually they literally found like a line of musket balls and they went, oh, this was the line. They were able to piece together like an actual legit battle that had happened. It wasn't one of the skirmishy ones. Like, I'm not sure if it's like big enough to actually be considered, part of the canon of like Northbridge and the Green. But, there was an actual legit engagement there. It wasn't just sort of the other firing between trees and behind walls and stuff. You hear
Before, since I haven't made my stand yet about Lexington Concord.
oh yeah, go ahead.
No, one of the points about the casualties that, and I always find this interesting, of course, it's spread over a wide, like you said, Boston Marathon area. But you look at some of the bloodiest actions happen directly in the middle of like a town, like the Northbridge, Concord, or the initial firing on the Green, and oh my God, this is the initial firing, and then through Minutemen or Arlington on the way back, people see that witness. And it'd be interesting to figure out what were the casualties in those towns compared to what ones were the casualties along the roadsides in between, and show that why people thought this was funnier. They also put up the instance, this is the first major armed conflict in 12 years. So it's like the Battle of First Manassas in the Civil War. 5,000 casualties are tremendous at the beginning of that. By the end of the Civil War, 5,000 casualties is considered a small little battle. So you have that first action. I think that's what gets lost in the shuffle, is that they're shooting now. I mean, any casualty is great, but this is the first time that it's come to blows offensively. And now it's the, oh crap, what do we do from here type thing. And you also have a very small population. I mean, compared to the Civil War, I mean, like 1% of the population will become casualties during the Rev War, and that's nothing to look down upon, I don't think. But we did have a comment on the thing, is that obviously there were other parallel events besides Boston that may have started. Give a shout out to Gabe here, because yeah, Patrick Henry had his way. There might have been shooting in Williamsburg. Patrick Henry and Sam Adams got together. There could have been friction anywhere, I think. So, but just wanted to give a shout out to Gabe. So I will say the stand happened at the proclamation line of 1763 was the start of the revolution right there. British
Very specific.
They took off the colonists, and then you start the domino effect. So eventually they start shooting. So it had or I give props as a drunk guy in Buckman's Tavern who decided to shoot from the window. And
we don't know for sure. We're never gonna know.
Lieutenant Jesse Adair picked the wrong way to go in Lexington, so took a by the Green instead of escaping. You could blame him, the hothead young redcoat. So
now, Stacy, you guys don't have a spot upstairs at the tavern where you said this is where the first shot was fired from? You guys don't do that? I'm just joking, by the way.
That's okay. There are lots of secrets around that. My understanding that I'm not going to give you all the details, because there has to be something for people to find out by coming to Lexington next year. But yeah, no, we definitely recreate the first shot artificially, because there's, as we've said there, I'm not sure we ever will know who committed it, because all the depositions on the British side are saying, oh, of course it was the colonists, and all the depositions, and you read them through, and maybe somebody will find a deathbed confession someday. But even so, the authenticity of that would be a cool thing to admit to on your deathbed, be famous for later on. So who knows? But the point is, because we have these really authentic reenacting groups who work really hard at getting things right, neither one of them is willing to do the first shot. So yes, we do have to artificially create the first shot.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about the reenactment, and because normally this time of year you guys have like a reenactment. Can you go talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's super fun. So it's funny because, Patriots Day as a holiday has been around since 1894. And it was actually, we take a lot of pride in the fact that it was partly because both Lexington and Concord had their own days to celebrate basically the battle. So it was Lexington Day and a Concord Day. And neither one of them, of course, would agree to a Lexington and Concord Day or anything like that. I think they did for a while, and then the rest of the Commonwealth was like, why would we want that? Acton's over there being like, what about us? And Salem and, other places. But anyways, the point is, it's been around since 1894. They didn't do an annual reenactment, though, until the 1970s. They did a couple things. We have some really fun images from like 1915, 1925. They would do a lot of those kinds of centennial pageants or things like that, which are really kind of fun because they'd be like,
not to interrupt, but I thought I read also like in like the 1820s, that like 1826 or something, there was a reenactment like with actual veterans who had actually been there or something.
They did so Lafayette visited in the fall of 1824, and I'm guessing there may have been some performance-y things for him, especially since he was a veteran himself. Yeah. That's my guess. But yeah, it was kind of those things we just played around with it, and it was kind of always honored in some way, but until like the 70s, we didn't have the regular, we do this every single year. But that means that for me and for generations, one or so behind me, we all have really fond memories of waking up at the butt crack of dawn at the crow, when the crow wakes up or whatever. I don't know. I don't have any good, Phil, you used to be from West Virginia, right? Do you have any good like expressions for that time of day?
You think we woke up that early in West Virginia and Maryland? We have good ones about night, not about the morning. So.
Anyways, very, very early. So these groups, I think the bicentennial was a big part of it. A lot of things that were happening around the bicentennial were really Rev War focused because it's that sort of origin story, on the US, and it's looking back at that time. We'll be the same way in 5 years in 2025. Yeah.
We'll all be there. We're all being there. We're all going to crash in the tavern too, by the way.
we can do that. It'll be fun. It's funny because we first started talking, I've totally not even answered your question yet, Mark, but we first started talking about the 250th like 3 or 4 years ago. I remember Rick Beyer, who's a really well-known historian of a couple different periods, but the Ghost Army from World War II, that's totally his strength. He's written books. He's actually compiled a whole Ghost Army archive. If you guys are interested in looking that up, it's great stuff. But Rick has been involved. He's produced a lot of our films and things like that. And it was Rick that, 3 years ago sat down and was like, okay, I know that 2025 is like 7 or 8 years from now, but we really should start to think about it. Okay. A lot of things happened since, but we're getting to that point. And I've done totally off topic, Mark, but yes, the reenactment happens. It's very cool. It's one of those traditions, where a lot of people who grew up in town, or if they live locally, will just, do the get up in the morning and drive in at 3 or 4 in the morning, get their space ahead of time. It's a pretty decent sized crowd every year. I think sometimes it can be as many as 20,000, but it really depends on the year. Marathon Monday, it's interesting too, because they made the Boston Marathon on Patriots Day for a reason. Like that was a very intentional, we're going to do this on a holiday that's already important to the Commonwealth and that kind of thing. And then, as probably a lot of you know, it's Marathon Monday. But that's okay. They're both great events. You guys don't say that.
They recreate Lexington, but then do they also then do the reenactors? They do like a whole battle road thing. So then they go to Concord and then back. And
right. So it's spread out over the weekend, and that's why it's been really nice for us doing virtual stuff, because we actually technically, we always say in Lexington, Patriots Day lasts like a week, when in reality, it probably lasts a couple months. Like it's actually a thing in Lexington where if you talk to anyone else who's involved with, the town or the historical society or anything, we all are like, oh yeah, let's schedule that meeting for after Patriots Day. We can't handle it now. Just well accepted. You can't do meetings in the middle of April. But yeah, it's a big thing. There's the Tower Park reenactment on the Saturday before, so that would have been yesterday. It did snow yesterday morning, so we're actually kind of glad they didn't have to do it in mud and snow. Although I'm sure they would have gone for it anyways. They're, the reenactors are game for anything. But that one's really cool because it's just kind of, it's not a recreation of a known battle. It's more a demonstration of the running battle that was going on the whole retreat. Essentially, it's not really intended to be one specific event, which is nice because I know the reenactors love it because they can like, run behind trees and kind of do like fun, different stuff because they're not trying to do exactly what their, person they're representing may have done. They're just showing how this may have gone. So that's usually on the Saturday before. And then there's also Battle Road stuff going on in the Minuteman National Park that Saturday morning. And then they all get on school buses and come to Tower Park. It's very funny because they go to Monroe Tavern and you literally see a school bus pull up full of British reenactors and then a school bus pull up full of colonial reenactors and then the camp followers that go with each. And they, unload onto the lawn and they're generally pretty pleasant, but there is, when they like get ready to march and like walk down to the park to do the battle, there is a lot of ribbing back and forth. There's some, inappropriate things, some hooting and hollering and accusations thrown, but they're just getting into the spirit of things. So that's a fun event. And then Sunday has been kind of different things over the years. There's like a handbell concert that we've done, that not we've done, but a local church has done. So there's some community things. And then, the morning of Battle Road or Battle Green. And then after that, yes, they usually go to Concord, do Old North Bridge, and then march back. And then most of them march in an afternoon parade in Lexington.
Wow.
So the reenactors are usually back in bed by like 5 p.m. on that day.
Yeah.
The 1 year they can actually kind of participate from bed and not fall asleep standing. So, yeah.
So we have one question here from Billy, who is part of ERW, and it's something I was going to ask the group too. So he asked, do you all think Margaret Gage, of course he's from New Jersey and so was she, informed Warren about the British plan to advance on Concord? And this is one of the things I was going to ask as one of the unknown pieces about Lexington and Concord. I think the first unknown would be who fired the first shot. We've already all agreed that we don't know who did that. No one's ever going to know. But one of the biggest mysteries is, how did Warren figure out that the British were leaving, the regulars were leaving on the 18th in the evening, and how that information make it to Warren and then of course out to the riders? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that, Phil, Stacy, or Mark, about, I really don't think Margaret Gage, Thomas Gage's wife, was part of that. But that's also one of those things that kind of that's been hanging around for a long time. If anyone has ever seen that, I'm just going to say it, the horrible TV show, Sons of Liberty, where it has Warren and Mrs. Gage being very much closer than just being informant to the colonial cause. She's definitely highlighted in that show. But what do you all think? Who do you think? How did Warren get the information from Gage?
I mean, so I don't think so. I'm going against that Sons of Liberty thing, as I actually remember having like high hopes for once for something. And when they had, I think Sam Adams running through the rooftops of Boston, looking like a
double guns, double pistols.
So looking at the GQ model, that kind of turned me off on it. But I mean, once again, who knows who has informants anywhere? I mean, like Dr. Benjamin Church is an informant, and no one suspects him for a while. But how can you hide any type of movement in a city where everybody's watching everybody at the same time, and any little surprising? And because I mean, when Warren sends the first person out, William Dawes, his information's kind of wrong, but it's sent out. So I mean, if he knew exactly what was going on, his information would have been correct almost to begin with. Well, he's just sending messengers out to say the warning. I think, I mean, everyone's a little trigger happy in the proverbial sense there, that something's going on. And everyone knows John Hancock and Sam Adams are both like the most wanted men in America for the British right now. I mean, so anything that could, like, what does Sam Adams say to John? Like, our job is not to be on the green, it's to be the behind the scenes to keep this going. So I think everyone's uber sensitive to anything that could be going out that way. Furthermore, the two messengers that went out for the roads the week before probably was a good tipping point as well. So She might have included, but put all that one message. I mean, she's not who's a Peggy shipping. I mean, she's not that important. But I mean, maybe just the fear of it is what gets Gage to get her sent away. But
Yeah, he does send. You're right. He does send her away after all these events. But
what good last thing I'll let Mark talk. What good military leader, if he knows that the fighting war is going to happen, is going to keep his wife there? I mean, you send her out of harm's way. That's what I mean. They did that all the way up through. That's customary. I mean, so.
But
Yeah.
what exactly was his mission and his orders, I guess? Because I've heard some different things. I mean, I've heard some different things. Was he going after the leaders, Sam Adams and Hancock? Was he just going for cannon? Was he going for the powder munitions? I mean, what do we know and how do we know it? I mean, do we have written documents, or is this just like conjecture? Or I guess not knowing exactly what his mission was.
I mean, we can throw out a plug for our friend J.L. Bell, who says it's all about what the cannon.
the cannon.
Yeah. So,
Cannon.
Boston, 1775. That's got to be a credible source. Maybe it's the cannons.
Hey, Mark. To answer your question, have you read a book? Mark, there's a book right here I can interest you in about the events.
Turn it around.
You would think that Mark would know something. No, I'm just kidding.
It had to start here before it got to there.
That's right.
I did read it, and it was very vague in that description.
It only took 30 minutes for us to get out of control. I'll let Stacey answer that.
Oh, honestly, all I was going to say is that yes, we do have orders. I would have to look in detail at what they said, because there may have been some unspoken, or kind of hints to things that we wouldn't be aware of necessarily. But as far as I remember, the actual orders were fairly explicitly: go to Concord, get the stolen ammunition and the cannon, destroy them so that they can't be used, or destroy the ammunition. And then,
You say stolen. How was it stolen?
this is why we need John Bell to do one of these. He knows.
No, Mark, when you say stolen, what do you mean by stolen? Like, you mean like the provincials had stolen? Is that what you're referring to? Well, you mean like the cannon? Yeah. Well, there were 4 cannon that were stolen out of Boston, and brass cannon, which are pretty rare, and all these militias had muskets and had personal firearm pieces. But when you start collecting cannon is more than just self-defense. Cannon is a sign that you are collecting arms for war. And I think that is when Gage, whenever you look at Gage, when Gage goes to Salem, well, not personally, but when he sends the regulars to Salem, they're looking for cannon. They're not necessarily looking for muskets and other items, though they will look for that in Concord, because they believe that they know they're collecting them there. You don't collect cannon and large amounts of powder, large amounts of musket balls, large amounts of clothing and food, unless you're trying to arm an army. Not just a militia from your town or your county, but an army. So I think that's where Gage is looking for those cannon, as JL's book points out. But they're also looking for supplies that are being stored out there, powder, clothing, you name it, anything an army would use.
Munitions.
So yes. So when you talk about stealing, I'm talking about the cannon. You also have the militia, and this is a good debate to have: is does the powder belong to the king, or does it belong to the colony, right? So I mean, you have a lot of these militias going in and taking powder. That happens here in Virginia, in Williamsburg, when the governor here takes the powder and hides it, and the colonial militia here in Williamsburg turns out, and there's a big fight over, does the powder belong to the king or does it belong to the colony? So when you say steal, that's why I'm asking you what you meant by stealing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is like at the crux of a big part of the argument or whatever. Having worked at Fort Sumter, which was the site of the first shot of the Civil War, there's a very similar thing. It's this federal fort that was built by federal dollars that sits in South Carolina. Is that South Carolina's property or the federal government's property? And you know, that
That's
led,
a different call, Mark. That's a whole different Zoom. That's a whole different thing, man.
I know.
ECW, not an ERW.
Thank you.
Because at that site, you know, and people are still very passionate about it. At Lexington, do you ever get people who are like, you know, very passionate that the British or the, you know, the British regulars were in the right and that they had every right to go in there to recover their stolen things, and you know, these guys who are treated as heroes, they weren't really heroes. Because it seems to me Rev War stuff isn't as contentious because it's so far gone that people don't really think about it that way.
Right. I think it's two things. I think it's partly that it has been quite a long time since that happened. You know, that being said, obviously we know of other wars that are contentious still, even though they weren't, you know, they were still a long time ago too. But either way, I think that, you know, the thing with that is that we get along really well with the British now. So it's not exactly, you know, we have a lot of British tourists who come and jokingly try to like pay for the beer that, you know, the soldiers stole at Monroe Tavern. There's still, you know, there's this sense that this is a battle that happened. I'm not sure you couldn't do like a person on the street thing in London right now and have them be like, yeah, the Americans should have had their freedom. You know, so there's this sort of like, okay, we're pretty much, other than the War of 1812, of course, you know, we've pretty much been on good terms for a while. So there's certain things that, you know, you're also looking at within the United States for Civil War stuff. You've got, I don't want to say people on both sides, but, you know, you have people who maybe associate more with a certain side during that war. And they all live in the same country now, you know, with English. It's kind of, we can still kind of pretend that England was benevolent, let us go without too much of a fuss. We won, it's over. You know, we all get along. So I think that's part of it, you know, the length of time, but also that we all kind of get along now. So it's not as big of a deal, that people died, but, you know, mistakes were made. Nobody was totally in the right or totally in the wrong. And now it's all over with. So
that was one of the funny things. Growing up or spending some years in England on a military base, American military base, we had a big July 4th event, and the English would come on and we said, isn't this like a touchy subject for you? And they would always respond. Of course, the English are a little bit, I'm not sure the right word, but they would always say that's the day they finally got rid of us. So it was about that day.
like the banter.
But yeah, it's a good banter and everything. But I think, yeah, I mean, the passage of time, especially post-World War II, when the country, I mean, come together to help save each other, kind of put those bad things. But I like to throw out, I mean, the common thought is one side's freedom fighters and another side's terrorists. So, I mean, at the same time, what Sam Adams and these guys are doing are like that. But I like to throw, let's throw another softball question out here instead of all these deep things. What's one myth about this April 19th that you would like to see removed? Because recently, Rick Atkinson, the great historian, came out with a book about the beginning of the revolution that says the British are coming. And I know, especially Stacy, folks in your area of Massachusetts, realize that Paul Revere never said that as he wrote out on the night of April 18th. So is that the biggest myth that we need in this happy hour to get rid of all the people listening around the world?
No pressure.
No pressure.
See, that one's tough because, again, I think part, you know, passage of time, part the fact that this war is so wrapped up in what being an American is. I think there's a lot of myths and things that are sort of part and parcel. I think the paucity of, you know, primary sources can be tricky too, because you can't, it's not as easy to fact check something like that. If you're, you know, a layperson, or if you're just kind of Googling, you know, did this happen? Did Paul Revere say this? You'll get articles and stuff, but it's not quite as easy to access the primary source information. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's the fact that he said that, which obviously is not what he would have said because everyone was a British citizen at the time. Definitely the fact that he was the, you know, only or sort of most significant writer. I mean, he definitely, I'd say pretty close to the most significant writer, let's be honest, in large part because he was a person with more influence than like Dawes or others. So like he would stop in town, he'd know exactly who to talk to get the information out there. You know, he would go to the right person's house, the selectman's house or whatever. But, you know, as we know, he's not the only one. He's not, you know, the one who got it as far out as he did. There's a lot of other people on the road. There's a lot of communications network. So having, you know, Longfellow exalt just him. That being said, it's way easier to pick one person whose name rhymes with things to be your most important rider. So I'm not gonna, that one, not so much. It's tough because I think that one of the things that, you know, we all like about it is that there are things like, you know, who fired first? Like we never will know, you know? And I think the more research that we do, the better, but I don't know if you're ever gonna fully debunk all the myths because people like myths, they're comforting.
Yeah, true.
Is there something that you guys have as like a pet, you know, I wish people would realize this?
I would say mine is not a pet peeve because I understand it, but it's the whole Minutemen versus militia there on the green at Lexington, where we don't have any evidence that there actually are Minutemen. They're just, you know, they're the training band, you know, the militia there for Lexington. So, you know, the monument there on the green, the national park just west of you all is Minuteman National Park. I think the Minutemen, you know, the legend and the myth of the Minutemen has kind of taken over the entire aspect of the beginning of the war, where, you know, as a kid, if you're interested in history and you read about it, you learn about it, you think everyone was a Minuteman that answered to the call at the minute's notice. And that really wasn't the case. And they're at Lexington, they're in the green, they were militia. They really weren't Minutemen. There is a difference. So that's one thing I know. You know, Alex Kane writes about that a lot. J.L. Bell writes about that a lot. But I think for me, going up there, it's the Minutemen versus the militia. But I guess, Stacey, I'm going to turn us back to you real quick. Is how is that perceived there in Lexington? As far as I'm sure most people in Lexington don't care one way or the other. But those interested in the history aspect of Lexington, how do you all talk about Minutemen versus militia?
So that one's actually really interesting. And that's something that we can play around with a little because as you guys know, Concord has its own Minuteman statue. And there's a lot of really funny, like, mistakes and mix-ups that are made over the years too. Like we've got, you know, people have t-shirts my mom has a t-shirt that says Lexington, Massachusetts, and it has a picture of the Concord Minuteman.
That's great.
But you know, there's called Minuteman too. And I think that's a big part of it is that whether, you know, that actually would deserve more research to see when, you know, that term started being used more often. So like you said, Robin, sort of a national, you know, idea. When did the Minuteman become, you know, the thing? It was just sort of Lexington Concord or whatever in the beginning, but then when did that become the more overarching term that people think of? Locally, it's definitely more of a 20th century, well, late 19th, early 20th, when a lot of the local soldiers came home from the Civil War. They formed the Lexington Minutemen Reenacting Company, basically. So there were some post-Civil War, like, you know, the kind of parading things that those groups would do. But they also, 1875, the centennial, they were present. So, you know, that Minutemen name was claimed in the 60s, 70s in Lexington. And then it just kind of became more part of the myth, you know, when the statue went up in I think it was 1906 or so. I'm going to get that wrong and someone's going to comment. But after it went up, you know, it was kind of like, this is our Minuteman statue. And again, I'm not sure when Concord's went up. I'd love to be able to say that we beat them, but I think it's around the same time. They may have beat us by a little. Either way, it's a Minuteman. You know, the town, the high school mascot is a Minuteman. Like there's the newspaper is a Minuteman. You know, so that's just kind of become, in some ways, we think of that as sort of separate. Like this is the mythological Minuteman, you know, figure. And that's separate from Thaddeus Harrington or John Parker or like the guy who was on the green. Like there's definitely, we use him as kind of the example of like the person who stood up, you know, on the green for what they believed in and stood up to the British. But I think in most people's minds, you get that there's sort of a difference, that the Minuteman is sort of the myth and then the militia are the men, you know.
Mark, what do you think?
I mean, to everybody's point, I mean, I do agree. I think that the British are coming. I mean, that it's interesting. That's one of the biggest Rev War history books that has come out in the past few years. And, you know,
but his defense, he's referring to not just the Paul Revere ride. He's referring to a larger context there.
I mean, the British.
And he would tell you that.
Yeah. But, you know, in common parlance, it's
we don't want to take on Pulitzer Prize winners here, Mark.
was the same.
You know, the whole battle road is filled with all sorts of like really interesting little anecdotes along the way. And that's why I really like David Hackett Fisher's Paul Revere's Ride. I think it does a good job of telling you about a lot of those little, all these different engagements, all these little anecdotes. One of them is of a guy who's, as the British Army's going by, I think he yells out, an Englishman's home is his castle, and is firing from his home there. It's just interesting that, literally saying I identify as English and I am, fighting for, English liberties. And here he is firing into British redcoats. I think that's kind of a story that people don't realize that this would be, and I've seen people make similarities of it, almost like us firing on the National Guard that's coming through our town or whatever. This, the fact that they identified as British at that point is pretty interesting. And there's another little anecdote, and I don't know, maybe Stacey, you could talk about it. Because first of all, I do think, emergent Revolutionary War, we're really all about the place, actually being able to go visit where these places happen. And, I went up there a couple of years ago and went onto the green to take a picture in front of the rock, stand your ground. That's there. If they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And there was another, back behind the green, there was a house that had like a plaque on it that said, one of the Minutemen, or militia, sorry, Rob.
It's fine, it's fine.
Was wounded and like crawled onto his like front doorstep and died in front of his family or something like that.
Barrington.
What? Yeah. I guess that's a pretty interesting story. Is that true? Is that a myth? I don't know. And that's the other thing though too, is I'm also not necessarily against. I know a lot of historians try to go down and disprove every story that's been told in the 200 years since the events happened, but I think there's a lot of interesting stories. I think it tells us a lot about our country how we have mythologized certain aspects and what that tells us about what we value and what's important to us. So I think it's pretty interesting. But that story was like, you talk about fighting for home and hearth. Here's a guy who dies on his front step fighting against the British. I thought it was pretty evoking. So
and there are. Sorry, Mark. There are a lot of those, and I think that's it's part of the personal side, and I think a lot of them are stories that some of them are stories that may or may not have happened, but then got sort of enlarged and expanded on in further retellings. And what I think is really interesting is that from our evidence, some of these stories, it's not like they were told to one person and then that person went off and really blew it up into something. We have stories of one of my favorite characters from that day was a woman called Mary Monroe Sanderson. She was a member of the Monroe family. As you know, there were lots and lots of Monroes in the town. I think at least 3 or 4 of them died on the green. William Monroe, who owned the tavern we manage, was the head of I'm forgetting his rank, but the point is he was the one in charge of guarding Hancock Clark House with a small group of men. So they were very involved. But the Monroe family had been POWs from the English Civil War. The original descendant who came in the 1620s came after that, 1650, excuse me. But the point is he had a Scottish accent, obviously, because he came from Scotland. But then the family, and I'm not going to say inbreeding because it was, as we said, small farming towns, there's a lot of families, you don't move too far outside your family. And if you have a big family, you might keep an accent. So I guess the point is Mary Monroe Sanderson still had a Scottish accent in 1775, and a British soldier was left in her bed at her home because they had to put him up. He'd been left behind by the troops, and she was really angry about it. Basically, she was like, I don't want to have to feed him. Why did we accept him? Like, what's going on? But this is all coming in like a really thick brogue, and she's just screaming at him. She's just like, get out. It's actually really great because when we did in 14 minutes, if you want to watch the In Their Own Words performance at the time we used to run it, we have a whole performance we did for 10 years where actors and reenactors read the exact words of someone who was there that day. And beautifully, we have a tour guide who's Scottish. And so she would use the Mary Monroe Sanderson character, and she would berate Paul O'Shaughnessy, who is one of the best known British reenactors around here. He's a local. He's amazing. He's been in the 10th Regiment of Foot for years. but she literally screamed at him and was like, get out of my bed. What are you doing? And, you know, it's that sort of like invasion of your home. You know, if you have troops marching through your town, there's, right, how do you react? And her reaction was, get him out. And they couldn't, but she so terrified him that he wouldn't supposedly eat anything in the house that was cooked by her unless someone else tasted it first. And the reason we know this, though, is because she told that story. She was like a young, you know, married woman at the time, and she literally told that story until she died in the 1850s in her 90s. So, you know, yes, I'm sure she probably conflated it a bit and made herself sound like amazing, like an avenging angel or something. But, you know, it happened. She, you know, it's a first person account of what happened. So there's some threads, even if things get expanded into myths, there's a lot of them, there's still kind of a thread of something that happened. You know, there's a gentleman in, I can't remember his name, but there was a gentleman in Minutemen, near Jason Russell House, who was like 70 something. And he ended up, I don't know if he actually got shot, but there were at least a number of bayonets that found purchase somewhere in his body, and like got up and kept fighting. Like he's this, and that actually happened. Like it's documented in many ways. So I think that's the trick thing, is kind of between like the mythology stuff and then the stuff that actually happened that day that was just extraordinary, you know, so piecing the difference between the two can be tricky sometimes. My rant's over.
Got a good question. Do the British have cavalry units in Boston? And if so, why not use the movement in Concord? So no cavalry units, no just infantry units. They use the light infantry and grenadier and marines to go out. I think that's, I don't know if this is a myth or one of the things that gets overlooked because we have myths, but I think one of the most two important facts is that first, you have the best of the British, supposedly light infantry and grenadiers that march out. However, most of those guys that are in those units have never been in action before, and they're now serving in a command structure under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith that they're unsure of. So that, I think, leads to the big myth that the British is the best military in the world, but it's built on a reputation. It's like, I hate to use a football reference, but it's like the Patriots now, after Tom Brady.
You were going to bring them up. I knew you couldn't help it.
Yeah, they're still the Patriots, but are they still good as they were last year? That's the question. Secondly, is that as they go out, one of the things that gets overlooked is that I think is interesting is what happens for when Barrett and those men come down the hill in Concord, is that that's where you can trace the U.S. Army to, I think, is the first time you have a command structure following commands coming down the hillside. And we ignore that part, that it wasn't just a spontaneous rabble of people that showed up to start shooting. A lot of them were under very strict command structures, loosely confined, and so, or confined, I mean, to their towns, maybe not overarching. But I think that's gets lost in the shuffle of all these other myths, or that some of these cool things that happen. Also, too, is that, yeah, we built the myth up of the British soldier to try to build them up like David versus Goliath type thing. I mean, a lot of these soldiers, 12 years since the last war ended, a lot of them probably joined up in those 63 to 75 economic downturn in the colonies because you're not producing material for the war anymore. Economic downturn in Great Britain, so you join the military. And the British Army, I mean, at least paid you decently. I mean, compared to something else, not everyone was drunk in a tavern. At least,
and those guys, Phil, to your point too, those guys have been in Boston for a while, for a few months, and constantly harassed, constantly worried about their own safety. And a lot of them, you know, the inline soldiers, a lot of them are younger, and you know, you can only get spit on and bricks thrown at you for so much before you crack. And a good point about the British, about the regulars, when they marched back from Concord back to Boston, I mean, they've been up for 12 hours. I mean, these guys are worn out. They're running out of water by the time they go through Lincoln on the way back. They're hungry, they're tired, they've been shot at. So, you know, these guys are really worn out by the time they pass Lexington on the way back to Boston. So, doesn't matter how good of an army it is anyways, if you're up that long and you're don't have any water to drink, it can be pretty rough experience all the way around. So yeah, I think that's,
well, speaking about water, I mean, can you tell a story about the well?
I need to tell it properly though. I should just pull up Joel's post. I'm literally going to. I'm just gonna let Joel tell the story.
Before we jumped on, everyone, Stacy was talking about this. This was a really cool I mean, Phil and I know the story, but she's got some really neat anecdotes about this. So.
Yeah, and I originally read it. There's in Fisher's Paul Revere's Ride. There's he mentions it as well, but it seemed like just like a deeply personal moment. You know, you watch movies like Saving Private Ryan or whatever, where two soldiers of opposite sides wind up just standing, 5 feet from each other, and there's like a hesitation moment where they're staring at each other, and I don't know, the humanity of it, and noticing like, oh, this is somebody not different than me. And then you also get to the moment of he's either going to kill me or I have to kill him. And there's a moment like that during the battle road that, it's pretty interesting. So
yeah, no, so it was and see, here's Acton. We'll give him credit. James Hayward, who was from Acton, was stopping at the Fisk House in Lexington for a drink of water, and that's where he ran into one of the regulars. They both fired. The regular fell dead, but then Hayward was also mortally wounded. So neither one of them, came out of that situation. And we actually, I'll try to see if I can. I'll send you guys something to post in the blog. But we have a picture of the pump that we have for the well, and that was later on. But it's just like you said, it's a very cool moment where it's that recognition of, oh yeah, you just need water too. And I think what you're saying before about, being an Englishman defending his castle, like in some ways this feels like, I'm not going to say a civil war, but it definitely feels like a war between, people who are still really closely tied together. There are definitely people who are feeling like they need that independence and this is an important thing, but there's definitely still some sort of fellow feeling, and I'm sure some sort of mixed up, oh yeah, we're fighting against you, but we could have had dinner together 5 years ago in London or whatever.
And you said you have the pump, but you said that was from later, but it's from the same well. But it was
from the same well. Yeah. So we have like a historic hand-colored postcard from I think the early 20th century that shows the well, and then we have the physical well. I'd have to check our records to see when we received into our collection. But we were founded in 1886, so it would have been sometime after 1886. Wow. So I'm guessing it probably was put up sometime in like probably Civil War era. It seems like that kind of mid 19th century pump, but I haven't done enough research on it.
Yeah. And does that well still exist, or do we not know?
The well, there's it. So I don't actually know. I think they probably filled in the well so that people didn't like fall in or whatever, but they do have, it's part of the national park. So they do have the edge of it. So they have monuments and stones and stuff to mark it.
Well, probably tell me. But that's the, the other thing too about these like, items that, you mentioned the archaeology at Parker's Revenge, which I think is awesome. The other thing that was awesome is, some of the musket balls they took from that archaeology, they actually tested for like protein analysis to see if there was actually, if they know it like hit humans or at least animals or something, if it still had residue of blood on it, which I think is awesome. That, I think it really shows you the value of archaeology at all these sites, that you can not only, determine exactly where they were, but you would be able to tie those things. If you could find out that, this ball was fired and, it hit there was some sort of protein on it. So it's likely, I think they did something similar at the Massachusetts Historical Society. They have a couple musket balls from the Boston Massacre that they also tested. So I just think it's kind of interesting to be able to tie objects or things to, a moment in time. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, we actually, that's one thing that we find, sorry, I'm jumping in, but we have obviously for good reasons, we have an incredibly strong, Rev War collection, specifically about the early days. In part because, like I said, Historical Society was founded in 1886. That's only, 110 years later, 111 years later. So there's definitely people in town whose, grandfather, great grandfather, fought. So they have his powder horn. I literally have a banker's box carton full of powder horns.
Wow.
So many powder horns. And like at least a few of them were, they're there that day. This actually, I'll have to share it with you guys, but this is some of the tattoos on my arm are from one of the powder horns we have in the collection.
Oh wow!
It was on the green. It's really cool.
Mark, that's cool. Mark, that is cooler than anything you got, buddy. I'm sorry. That's pretty cool.
Sorry.
And Mark has some cool stuff, but that's not as cool as that.
So it's really cool. So yeah, there's so much stuff that was that it was literally the item was physically there on the green. We weren't, and the person who was is long gone, but the item was there. And I think that's really a neat part of that connection, is that we can literally look at stuff like we can tell the story of the Hayward, well, and then literally we have the pump in collection storage. Friday, I'll send the details to you guys, but Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, I'm going to do like a collection spotlight on some of our April 19th stuff.
And that's a great segue for us to wrap up here, because we don't want to make Stacy's character any worse than we've already made it by hanging out with us tonight. Stacy, so to give you a little chance to talk about, Lexington Historical Society, what you guys do, some of the places that you guys have, and obviously we want to encourage everyone to visit. Phil and I have been there a bunch of times. It's a great space. You guys have been great to us. But if you want to take a few minutes about what you guys are doing and some of the cooler stuff you guys are working on right now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So like I said, the Historical Society was founded in 1886. So we've been around for a while. And we really, we've managed the historic houses that we manage, which are the Hancock Clark House, Buckman Tavern, and Monroe Tavern. And they basically tell the story of not quite all the way to the end of the retreat, and not like, well, actually really the full way, from like midnight to at least like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because we've got Hancock Clark House, which is where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were staying, along with Dorothy Quincy and John's aunt Lydia Hancock. And the reason they were staying there is because the home had belonged to Reverend John Hancock, our John Hancock's grandfather, who was a minister in Lexington. And then it was taken over when the next minister came along. Reverend Jonas Clark was living in the home, and he was also a very fiery minister for the town. He's very much a patriot. So that's another reason why Hancock and Adams were staying there. So that's where you can go and hear about, the story. You can see the room where Revere and Adams slept. We also have Buckman Tavern, which everyone knows is the one, right across from the green. That's maybe my myth. That's maybe my myth that I need busted. The one that they were, drunk and staggering onto the green, because we have no evidence. I mean, I'm sure they were having something to warm up. You don't go into a tavern, but a tavern's not a bar. They're not out there really just taking shots, maybe a few for courage if they are anticipating what's happening next. But, we have no real evidence that they had drank too much or were drinking too much in the tavern. But it's a great tavern. Like I said, literally the tap room where they were, and the historic front door where they were is no longer on the door, because the house became a family home over the years and was remodeled a bit. Not a ton, it's pretty good, but we have the historic front door with a bullet hole that went right through the front door. And the cool thing about that, sorry, I'm jumping ahead again, but tomorrow, and I'm actually taping it after I get off with you guys tonight, Joel Bowie and Chris Fox, who are two local military experts, came and did some research March 13th, just before we all kind of went into quarantine. And they came and looked at the musket ball strikes that we have. We have one at Monroe Tavern and we have one at Buckman Tavern. And so they examined those, and we're actually gonna have a program tomorrow afternoon at 3 about the battle damage to Buckman Tavern. So that's a really cool, I mean, that's, something that was right there. It's a witness house. It's the one from whence, the militia came out. So that's a wonderful site. And then we have the Monroe Tavern, which kind of looks at the afternoon at the retreat. It was right around the point where Percy's troops coming from Boston were running into Smith's troops coming from, on the retreat from Concord, and Percy's troops had cannon. So that obviously made a huge difference. They actually shot kind of a warning shot through Lexington Center to kind of provide cover for the retreating troops, and they put a hole through the meeting house door. The meeting house was torn down, so we don't have that, unfortunately. I wish we did. But the point is, they took over Monroe Tavern after kind of clearing that cover for themselves, and they were at the tavern using it as a field hospital for probably an hour and a half or so on the afternoon before they commenced the march to Boston through Menotomy. So it really was, you really can sort of do the midnight to 3 p.m. or so thing if you visit all 3 houses. They're not open at midnight, obviously, but the cool thing is we're doing virtual tours. So you can go look at that house at midnight tonight, and you will be there virtually when Revere was there. 245 years, well, last night, I guess. Sorry, last night.
Close.
That whole, Patriots Day being on the Monday, not the 19th, that confuses people. But it's just, we've worked really hard to get everything together. We're doing a virtual Patriots Day. If you go to our website, which is lexingtonhistory.org, easy to get to, Patriots Day button right on the front page. And we're just doing everything that we could possibly do virtually. We're showing video of past reenactments and parades. We're providing live programs like the battle damage program I mentioned. We had a children's author reading a Q&A this afternoon. We have events going on throughout the day and throughout the week, basically, to try to, consolidate all of the resources, because everyone's really disappointed, that things are canceled. We all totally understand why. Obviously, this is not a time to have things open. We've had our historic houses closed for over a month. But it's a time that people really appreciate. And so I think it's nice if we can all kind of enjoy it. And like I said, our reach, you can literally do it from anywhere now, as long as you have, a decent internet connection, which I know is not universal, but you can access all that information. So Minutemen National Park's also doing a ton of virtual Patriots Day stuff, Ask a Ranger and things like that. So if you actually just look for the hashtag virtual Patriots Day, you should come up with some content, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Or like I said, people can always go to the website and check out the stuff we have going on.
Are you all making plans for the 250th?
We're just trying to get through this year first. I mean, like I said, we mentioned the 250th like 7 or 8 years ago, so we've got it on our minds.
Okay.
This year's tricky. This year's real tricky. We still don't know when we're going to reopen. I'm sure those of you who also are working at historic sites are the same. We don't know when we're going to reopen. We're trying to figure out maybe a staggered reopening plan where we have one house open. We have audio wands at Buckman, which is not ideal
Right.
in the situation. So I just opened a new exhibit on 250 years of women in Lexington, and everything from the Rev War straight through abolition and suffrage and women's rights, civil rights. And it has like 7 interactive components. And it was open for like 4 days. And then we were like, oh, we can't do that anymore. So we're trying to figure out what we're going to do if and when we reopen. We're working on figuring out how the site's
And
going to be.
that's everybody in our field, everyone I think on this call is doing the same thing. So
Right, exactly.
difficult.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, it has been about an hour, and so happy hour. We may not be definite on a lot of things, but we're definite on happy hour ending at an hour. But I'd like to thank especially Stacy Fraser. We have a comment that you are excellent, so we may need to have you back. You definitely held this group together and provided the highlight for the hour. So thank you for joining Emerging Revolutionary War. Thank you, Mark. Now in the shadows, much like
Like darker and darker.
as well for this. So we also will come back to you next week on another Rev War Revelry. So pay attention to our blog and Facebook, or give us a shout out on what our next topics should be. So we're going to take everything under consideration. But lastly, Stacey has mentioned it. Make sure you go to Lexington Historical Society's Facebook page. Tune in tomorrow, or if you're a night owl, midnight, go visit Monroe Tavern. So
Yeah,
virtually.
Please, don't bang on the door.
But thank you again, Stacy, Rob, Mark, everyone. Take care, and we'll see you next week on Emerging.
Thank you all.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.